Chris was certain he could hear his own pulse. "Happy New Year," he whispered. Her mouth was the softest thing he'd ever felt. Hi friends, and welcome back to another episode of our book club series. Reading number 7, I think. We're doing reading number 7, and we're starting on page 87 on the second section. It was not a Merry Christmas. Chris spent the morning alone in his room at the condo, sitting on the bed while he heard the strained voices of everyone else downstairs opening presents. The only person who actually seemed to be having a good time was Kate, who'd slept through the whole debacle the night before. He wondered what they were going to do with his presents. Return them? Give them to Goodwill? He doubted he'd ever see them, which truly sucked because he had a pretty good idea that he was getting a pair of new skis he could have used that very day. Chris flopped face down on his bed and tried to convince himself his old skis were fine just the same. Just after 3, his mother came into the room. She was wearing her ski bib and her goggles were looped around her neck. Seeing her, Chris felt a pang of envy. For all he'd been sick of skiing yesterday, he would have given anything to have stayed on the slopes instead of hunting for that stupid hare. Gus laid a hand on his arm. "Hi," she said. "Merry Christmas." "Whatever," Chris said, rolling away from her. "Your father and I decided that if you want, you can go out skiing for the rest of the day." The rest of the day translated to like all of an hour. Chris noticed his mother hadn't mentioned any presents. "Emily's here," she said softly. "She didn't want to ski without you." As if I'd give a flying fuck, Chris thought. But instead he only snorted. He watched his mother leave the room, and then he noticed Emily cowering in the doorway. "Hi," she said. "How are you?" "Peachy," Chris grumbled. "You, want to come with me?" He didn't. He would have crawled into a lifeboat with her if their ship was sinking. He wouldn't have crawled into a lifeboat with her if their ship was sinking. It didn't matter that she had been frightened last night and sick probably from the one sip she'd taken. It didn't matter that Chris had never had a chance to tell her why he was drinking in the first place. Emily had become a traitor, and he couldn't forgive that so quickly. "I went down to Blackadder by myself," she said. At that, Chris looked up. Blackadder was one of the toughest runs Sugarloaf had, full of twists and drop-offs and curves that came out of nowhere. He'd gone down a few times, but always slowly, since he had to wait for Emily to get over her fear and ski a little ways before she got terrified again. If Emily had gone down alone, it had probably taken her 2 hours. Suddenly, something unfurled in the center of Chris's chest. He could get back at Emily for last night, and so easily. She was feeling guilty. That was clear enough. She'd be willing to jump through whatever hoop he asked. He'd take her down a run tougher than Blackadder, one that would have her shaking in her boots by the time she reached the bottom. Chris let a smile stripe his dark mood. "Well," he said, standing up, "what are we waiting for?" Emily shivered like an aspen leaf at the drop-off point of Sugarloaf's highest lift, holding her poles in front of her like a barrier between the steep ski run and herself. Chris yelled impatiently over the wind. "Come on." She bit her lip and pushed off, snow plowing to keep down her speed. But the curve was too sharp, and she wound up in a tangle of arms and legs and skis just behind Chris. "That sucked," she breathed. Chris smiled nastily. "That's the easiest part," he said. She was seriously considering taking off her skis and walking down the mountain at this point. But she wanted to get back in Chris's good graces. After all, it was her fault that Chris had spent the morning in his room. If Chris was being charitable enough to let her ski with him, then she'd ski upside down if that's what he wanted. She watched Chris wind down the hill, his hips rolling from side to side with cat-like grace, the tip of his tasseled hat catching the wind. A natural athlete, he made it look easy. Taking a deep breath, Emily pushed off with her poles. At the very least, she thought, he'll break my fall. She rounded the first turn with too much speed, so that she overshot Chris, parallel but a few feet below him on the hill, flying at an alarming speed to the edge of the groomed trail. "Cut the corner!" she heard Chris yell, and she almost laughed. Did he really think she had that much control? One ski, then the other, bumped over the ridge of the trail's edge. She felt thin branches score her cheeks, snow drop from the overhead boughs of pines. She tried to keep her knees together, her feet straight, praying as a cold sweat broke out beneath her arms and down her neck. She sensed the air quiver as Chris called her name, and then her ski caught in a furrow of brush, and by the time Emily fell, the only thing she felt was relief. She's lucky she didn't break her neck. Could have been a lot worse. That's got to hurt like hell. They didn't think Chris could hear them, but he'd managed to catch every word. The paramedics who'd come to the base lodge to transport Emily in an ambulance had no choice but to take Chris with them to the hospital, since he was attached to the stretcher like a leech, and her parents had not yet responded to the page. He had remained beside Emily in the ambulance and even in the ER, and after a while people stopped trying to remove him. When she'd gone off the trail like that, Jesus, he couldn't even think about it without shaking. He hadn't wanted to leave her, but he needed to get help. He flagged someone over, told them to get the ski patrol, and ditched his skis so that he could run to wherever Emily was lying. Her hat had fallen off, and her hair was spread all over the snow. He knew better than to move her, but he picked up her hand and felt his stomach turn over. It was his fault. If he hadn't brought Emily on this run, looking to make her miserable, she never would have skied off the trail. Emily regained consciousness while the ambulance was swaying toward the hospital. "It hurts," she said, swallowing hard. "How come?" He would not tell her that her leg was broken, her ankle twisted in an impossible direction like a silly cartoon's character. He would not tell her how far she'd rolled before she came to a stop, how scrapes and bruises changed her face. "You fell," he said simply. "You're going to be okay." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I'm scared," she whispered, and his throat tightened. "Where's my mom?" "Coming," he said, "but I'm here now." He leaned closer, awkwardly slipping his arms around her. He let his eyes drift shut and decided in that instant that for the rest of Emily's life he would be her guardian angel. Emily's broken leg took priority over Chris's transgression with Sambuca. Melanie and Gus insisted that they ought to go back to Bainbridge, and Michael was leaning toward that too. But in the end, Emily convinced them to finish out their vacation. Out of solidarity, everyone stayed in, foregoing skiing for marathon games of Scrabble and Monopoly. By the second day, Emily was tired of being treated like an invalid, and she shooed everyone back to the slopes. After some deliberation, even Melanie agreed to go for an hour or so. But Chris refused to leave Emily's side. "I don't feel like it," he said, and nobody pushed him. He sat with Em on the couch in front of the fireplace, her leg propped up on the coffee table. They watched the flames and talked. Chris telling her about the hair, Emily confessing her guilt about ratting on him. They joked about getting the sambuca from the freezer while their parents were out of the condo. He was reminded of what it had been like when they were little. How he could think his thoughts and they'd wind up in Emily's head. It was not until the fire cracked loudly, water bursting within wood, that Chris realized he'd fallen asleep. He glanced down and saw that Emily had drifted off too. She was still sleeping, and somehow she'd wound up tucked under his arm. She was kind of heavy and uncomfortable. He felt the damp heat of her cheek through the cotton on his shirt. Measured the amazing length of her eyelashes. Her breath smelled like berries. Just like that, he was hard as a rock. Flushing bright red, he tried to adjust the fly of his jeans without waking Em. But that only made his arm brush against her chest, her breast. For God's sake, this was Emily. The same Emily who'd used his high chair when he'd outgrown it. Who had helped him dry up slugs with salt. Who camped out with him for the first time in his own backyard. How could a girl he'd known his whole life suddenly be someone he didn't recognize at all? She stirred, blinking a little and pushing off him when she realized she was draped across his chest. "Sorry," she said, still close enough for her word to fall onto his lips, so that even as Chris shrugged, he could taste her. Chris didn't think he'd ever get her alone. For 3 days he tried to finage ways for Emily to lean on him, brush against him, touch him. He wanted to kiss her, and his golden opportunity was vanishing before his eyes. Their parents were supposed to be going to a New Year's party thrown by Sugarloaf. But Melanie and Michael were reluctant to go, afraid that if Emily needed them, they'd be unreachable. The four of them stood in their snazzy black evening clothes, trying to come to a decision. "I'm 13, Emily said. "I don't need a babysitter." "If anything happened," Chris added, "I know how to drive. I could always just take the other car to the base lodge." Gus and James whirled around. "That," James said dryly, "is something we didn't need to know." He turned to Michael. "Take your keys," he said. Melanie, sitting beside Emily on the couch, felt her forehead. "I broke my leg," Emily groaned. "I don't have the flu." Gus touched Melanie's shoulder. "What do you think?" Melanie shrugged. "What would you do?" "Go, I guess. There's nothing else you can do to make her comfortable." Melanie stood up, smoothing Emily's hair back from her forehead. Emily scowled and fussed it back into position. "All right, but I may come back before midnight." Melanie smirked at Gus. "And you're a liar, you know. If that was Kate, you wouldn't go farther than 3 feet away." "You're right," Gus said amiably. But didn't I sound convincing?" She turned to Chris. "You'll get Kate to bed on time?" Kate, upstairs, wailed. "Mom," she cried. "Can't I stay up till midnight?" "Sure," Gus yelled back. She glanced at Chris, speaking more softly. "When she conks out on the couch in half an hour, carry her upstairs." Then she kissed her son and waved to Emily. "Be good," she said, and with the others, left Chris and Emily to their own devices. Chris's hands twitched in his lap. They ached, waiting to touch Emily, who was all of 10 inches away. He curled his fingers into fists, hoping they wouldn't betray him by crawling over towards Emily's thigh, skimming her hip. Chris," Emily whispered. "I think Kate's out." She nodded to her left, where Kate was curled asleep. "Maybe you should carry her up." Was she trying to say she wanted to be alone with him, too? Chris tried to catch Em's eye to see what she really meant, but she was scratching the itchy skin around the top of her cast. He scooped his sister into his arms and hauled her to her bedroom. He tucked her in, then closed the bedroom door. He made sure to sit closer to Emily this time, stretching his arm along the back of the couch. "Can I get you something? A drink? Popcorn?" Emily shook her head. "I'm okay," she said. She took the remote control and flipped through the channels. Chris let his thumb graze the edge of Emily's sleeve. When she didn't jump, he added another finger, and another, until his whole hand was brushing her shoulder. He couldn't look, just couldn't. But he felt Emily go absolutely still, felt the temperature of her skin increase by faint degrees, and for the first time that night he began to relax. In the flurry of the quandary whether or not to leave Emily alone, everyone had neglected to notice that the party invitation said, "Bring your own booze." James volunteered to run out and get a bottle of champagne, Gus reminding him to return before midnight. He did not bother to check his watch until after pulling into the parking lot of the third closed supermarket. "It's 11:26, he thought, unaware that the Timex's batteries had died just moments before. "I'll run back to the condo and get a bottle of wine." But it was actually 2 minutes before midnight. Chris remembered once when he'd gotten a butterfly to land in his palm. He kept absolutely still, certain that if he even thought a weird thought, the beautiful creature would flutter away. It was like that now with Emily. She hadn't said a thing, and neither had he, but for the past 42 minutes he'd had his arm around her, as if it was a perfectly normal thing for him to do. On the television, people in Times Square were going nuts. There were men with purple hair and women dressed like Marie Antoinette, guys his age bouncing teeny babies who should have been asleep. The ball began to slip down, tugged by the crowd's chants, and Chris felt Emily shift the teeniest bit toward him. And then it was 1994. Emily rubbed her thumb over the mute button on the remote. There was no shouting in the living room of the condo, no fanfare. Chris was certain he could hear his own pulse. "Happy New Year," he whispered, and he bent his head toward hers. She turned in the same direction, and they bumped noses. But then she laughed, and it was all right because this was M. Her mouth was the softest thing he'd ever felt. And he pulled on her jaw to make it open a little, and his tongue ran over the neat line of her teeth. Immediately she pulled back, and so did Chris. From the corner of his eye, he could see 1,000,000 people in Times Square, jumping up and down and laughing. "What are you thinking?" he whispered. Emily turned bright red. "I'm thinking, wow," she said. Chris smiled against her neck. "Me too," he said, searching for her again. When James entered the condo, the television was blaring with celebration. Then suddenly it fell quiet. He stopped in the kitchen, wrapping his hand about the throat of the champagne bottle. Setting it on the kitchen table, he continued toward the living room. The first thing he saw was the television, which mutely and definitively announced that it was already 1994. The second thing he saw was Chris and Emily on the couch kissing. Uh-oh. Let's see how this goes. Stunned at first, James couldn't move, couldn't speak. They were kids, for God's sake. The incident with the Sambuca was still raw in his mind, and he could not believe that his son would be stupid enough to do, in quick succession, 2 things he shouldn't. Then he realized Chris and Emily were doing exactly what everyone had always hoped they would. He backed away without disturbing them, leaving the condo, getting into the car. By the time he reached the base lodge, he was still smiling. Gus spotted him, her anger riding bright on her cheeks, confetti graying her hair. "You're late," she said. Grinning, James told her and the Golds what he stumbled across. Melanie and Gus laughed, delighted. Michael shook his head. "You're sure?" he said. "You're sure," he said, "they were just kissing." The 4 lifted their water glasses, toasting 1994, and none of them noticed that James had forgotten the champagne. Now. So we're back to now. Mid to late November 1997. In the days after Emily's death, Melanie found herself riveted by the most ordinary things. The whirl of the wood of the dining room table, the mechanism of a Ziploc baggie, the pamphlet on toxic shock syndrome in the tampon box. For hours at a time, she could stare at these things as if she had not seen them a million times before, as if she had never known what she was missing. She felt a call to detail that was obsessive, but necessary. What if tomorrow morning one of these things turned up missing? What if her only knowledge of these items came from memory? She knew now that at any time she might be tested. Melanie had spent the morning tearing off pages of a small notepad and throwing them into the trash can. She watched the white pages pile up a teeny blizzard. When the trash bag was half full, she yanked it from the can to carry it outside. It had started to snow, the first snow of the season. Mesmerized, she dropped the trash bag, oblivious to the cold or the fact that she was shivering without her coat, and held out her hand. As a snowflake landed on her palm, she brought it close to examine and watched it melt before she'd had the chance. The telephone startled her, its harsh jangle wrangling through the open kitchen door. Melanie turned and ran inside, breathlessly reaching for the receiver on the wall. "Hello?" "Yes," a floating voice said. "I'd like to speak with Emily Gold." Me too, Melanie thought, and she'd silently hung up the phone. Chris stood uncomfortably in the office of Dr. Emanuel Feinstein, pretending to look at the photographs of covered bridges decorating the walls and glancing surreptitiously instead at the secretary who was typing so fast her fingers were a blue blur. Suddenly there was a buzz on the intercom. The secretary smiled at Chris. "You can go in now," she said. Chris nodded and walked through the adjoining door, wondering why he'd been cooling his heels for the past half hour if there wasn't another patient in there. The psychiatrist stood up, walked around his desk. "Come on in, Chris. I'm Dr. Feinstein. It's nice to meet you." He nodded to a chair, not a couch, Chris noticed, and Chris sank into it. Dr. Emanuel Feinstein was not the old geezer he conjured up in his head based on that name, but a guy who would have looked just as comfortable hauling wood as a lumberjack or manning an oil rig. He had thick blonde hair that brushed his shoulders, and he stood a good half foot taller than Chris. His office was decorated much like Chris's dad's study, dark wood and tartan plaids and leather books. So, the psychiatrist said, taking the wing chair across from Chris, how are you feeling? Chris shrugged, and the doctor leaned forward to pick up the tape recorder on the coffee table between them. He played back the snippet, hearing his own question, and then shook the device. Funny thing about these, Dr. Feinstein said, they don't pick up nonverbal clues. There's only one rule in here, Chris. Your answers have to actually emit a sound frequency. Chris cleared his throat. Any begrudged liking he'd started to have for this shrink vanished again. Okay, he said gruffly. Okay, what? I'm feeling okay, Chris muttered. Are you sleeping well, or are you sleeping all right? Eating? Chris nodded, then stared at the tape recorder. Yes, he said pointedly. I've been eating okay, but sometimes I can't sleep. Was this something you had a problem with before? Before, like with a capital B. Chris shook his head, and then his eyes filled with tears. It was an emotion he was getting used to. It happened whenever he thought about Emily. How are things at home? Weird, Chris admitted. My father acts like nothing ever happened. My mom talks to me like I'm a 6-year-old. Why do you think your parents are treating you the way they are? I guess because they're scared, Chris answered. I would be. What could it be like to find out in a matter of minutes that the kid you believed the sun rose and set on was not the person you thought? Suddenly, he frowned at the psychiatrist. Do you tell my parents what I say here? Dr. Feinstein shook his head. I'm here for you. I'm your advocate. What you say here stays here. Chris eyed him warily, like that was supposed to make him feel better. He didn't know Feinstein from a hole in the wall. The psychiatrist asked. Chris picked at a hole in his jeans. Sometimes, he murmured. Do you have a plan? No. Do you think Friday night might have changed your mind? Chris looked up sharply. I don't understand you, he said. Well, why don't you tell me what it was like for you, seeing your friend? She wasn't my friend, Chris corrected. She was the girl I loved. That must have made it even more difficult, Dr. Feinstein said. Yes, Chris said, watching it all over again. Emily's head snapping to the left as if an invisible hand had slapped her. The blood that ran through his fingers. He glanced at the psychiatrist, wondering what the man expected him to say. After prolonged silence, the doctor tried again. You must be very upset. I pretty much cry at the drop of a hat. Well, the psychiatrist said, that's perfectly normal. Oh, right, Chris snorted. Perfectly normal. I spent Friday night getting 70 stitches. My girlfriend is dead. I've been locked up in a psycho ward for 3 days, and now I'm here, where I'm supposed to tell someone I don't even know everything that's on my mind. Yeah, I'm a perfectly normal 17-year-old. You know, Dr. Feinstein said evenly, the mind is a remarkable thing. Just because you can't see the wound doesn't mean it isn't hurting. It scars all the time, but it heals. He leaned forward. You don't want to be here, he said. So where would you like to be? With Emily, Chris said unhesitatingly. Dead? No. Yes. Chris averted his gaze. He found himself looking at a second door, one he hadn't noticed, one that did not lead back to the waiting room through which he'd entered. It would be, Chris realized, the door through which he'd exit, a way out so that no one would ever have to know he'd been inside. He looked at Dr. Feinstein and decided that someone who protected your privacy could not be all that bad. Where I'd like to be, Chris said softly, is a few months back. The moment the elevator door opened, Gus was fluttering all over her son, slipping her arm about his waist and falling into step and chattering as she whisked him out of the medical building where Dr. Feinstein's office was located. So, Gus said, the moment they settled into the car, how did it go? There was no answer. Chris's head was turned away from her. For starters, she said, do you like him? Was this a blind date? Chris muttered. Gus pulled the car out of the lot, suddenly making excuses for him. Is he a good psychiatrist? She pressed. Chris stared out the window. As opposed to what? He asked. Well, do you feel better? He turned to her slowly, pinned her eyes with his. As opposed to, he repeated, to what? James had been raised by a set of Boston Brahmin parents who had elevated New England stoicism to an art form. In the 18 years he'd lived in their household, he'd seen them kiss publicly only once, and that was so fleeting that he came to believe he'd surely imagined it. Admitting to pain, to grief, to ecstasy was frowned upon. Admitting to pain, to grief, or to ecstasy was frowned upon. The one time James, as a teenager, had cried over the death of a pet dog, his parents acted as if he committed a harakiri on the marble tiles of the foyer. Their strategy for dealing with things unpleasant or emotional was to push past the mortifying situation and get on with their life as if it had never happened. By the time James had met Gus, he'd finally mastered the technique and had rejected it out of hand. But that night, alone in the basement, he tried desperately to recapture that blessed, intentional blindness once again. He was standing in front of the gun cabinet. The keys were still in the lock. He'd mistakenly believed his children were old enough to dispense with the excessive caution he'd used years ago. He'd mistakenly believed his children were old enough to dispense with the excessive caution he'd used years ago. He twisted the keys and let the door swing open, revealing the rifles and shotguns lined up like matchsticks. Conspicuously absent was the Colt pistol, still impounded by the police. James touched the barrel of the .22, the first gun he'd ever given Chris to shoot. Was this his fault? If James hadn't been a hunter, if the guns were not accessible, would any of this have happened? Would there have been pills or carbon monoxide poisoning? Would the results have been less catastrophic? He shook off the thought. This sort of obsessing would get him nowhere. He needed to move on, to get going, to look forward. As if he'd suddenly discovered the secret of the universe, James pounded up the cellar stairs. He found Gus and Chris sitting in the living room together. They both looked up when he burst into the doorway. "I think," he announced breathlessly, "that Chris should go back to school on Monday." "What?" Gus said, coming to her feet. "Are you crazy?" "No," James said, "but neither is Chris." Chris stared at him. "You think," he said slowly, "that going back to school, where everyone is going to look at me like I'm some kind of head case, is going to make me feel better?" "This is ludicrous," Gus said. "I'll call Dr. Feinstein. It's too soon." "What does Dr. Feinstein know? He's met Chris once. We've known him forever, Gus." James crossed the room and stood in front of his son. "You'll see. You'll get back in with your own crowd, and you'll be yourself in no time." Chris snorted and turned away. "He's not going to school," Gus insisted. "You're being selfish." "I'm being selfish." Gus laughed and folded her arms over her chest. "James, he isn't even sleeping at night, and he—" "I'll go," Chris interrupted softly. James beamed, clapped Chris hard on the shoulder. "Excellent," he said triumphantly. You'll get swimming again and excited about college. Once you're busy, things are going to look a hell of a lot better." He turned to his wife. "He just needs to get out, Gus. You coddle him, and he's got nothing better to do than think." James rocked back on his heels, certain that the air in the house was circulating lighter and more freely with his small shift of focus. Disgusted, Gus pivoted and walked out of the room. He frowned at her retreating back. "Chris is fine," he called out, for good measure. "There's nothing wrong with him." It was a few moments before he felt the heavy burden of his son's gaze. Chris's head was tipped to the side, as if he was not angry at James, but truly confounded. "Do you really think that?" he whispered, and left his father standing alone. The telephone woke Melanie with a start, causing her to sit up disoriented in her own bed. When she lay down for a nap, the sun had been shining. Now, she could not even see her hand in front of her. She fumbled along the nightstand. "Yes," she said. "Hello? Is Emily there?" "Stop," Melanie whispered, and let the receiver drop while she buried herself once again beneath the covers. Melanie went grocery shopping every Sunday morning at 8:30, when the rest of the world was still relaxing in bed with the paper and a cup of coffee. Last Sunday, of course, she hadn't. And with the exception of food left over from sitting Shiva, there was nothing in the house to eat. As she tugged on her coat and struggled with the zipper, Michael watched her. You know, he said awkwardly, I can do this for you. Do what? Melanie said, stuffing her hands into mittens. Go shopping, run errands, whatever. Seeing Melanie's pinched face made Michael think he was going about grieving all wrong. He was dying on the inside because of Emily, but not on the outside. And somehow it didn't seem as potent a sorrow as his wife's. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to look at her. I can go if you don't feel up to it yet. Melanie laughed. Even to her own ears, it sounded wrong, like a melody for a flute being played on a honky-tonk piano. Of course I'm up to it, she said. What else do I have to do today? Well, Michael said, making a spur-of-the-moment decision, why don't we go together? For the slightest moment, Melanie's brows drew together. Then she shrugged. Suit yourself, she said, already leaving. Michael grabbed his coat and ran outside, where Melanie was in the car. The engine was running, the exhaust creating a cloud around the vehicle. So, where are we going? Market Basket, Melanie said, turning the car around. We need milk. We're going all the way there for milk? We could get that at... Are you going to be pleasant company, Melanie said, her lips twitching, or are you going to be a backseat driver? Michael laughed. For a moment, it had been easy. In the past week, he could count on one hand the number of moments like that. Melanie pulled out of the driveway and turned onto Wood Hollow Road, accelerating. Although he tried to keep his eye from straying there, Michael instinctively glanced toward the Hart's house. A figure was walking along the edge of the driveway, setting out the trash can at the lip of the road. As the car drew closer, Michael made out Chris's face. He was wearing a hat and gloves, but no coat. His eyes lifted at the sound of the approaching car, and, as Michael had experienced, instinct kicked in when he realized it was the Golds. Probably before he even realized what he was doing, Chris had lifted his hand in greeting. Michael felt the car pull toward the right, toward Chris, as if the boy had magnetized not only the direction of their thoughts, but also the vehicle's tracks. He shifted in his seat and waited for Melanie to realign the car. Instead, it swerved so far to the right that she went off the blacktop. Michael felt the car jolt forward as she pressed down on the gas pedal, barreling toward Chris. Chris's mouth rounded into an O. His hands twitched on the handle of the garbage can as his feet remained rooted to the driveway. Melanie's hands shifted, cutting the car even closer, and just as Michael snapped out of his stupefied paralysis to wrench the steering wheel from her grasp, she turned it herself, nicking the trash can. Chris safely bolted several feet back down the driveway as the barrel bounced into the street and spilled garbage across Wood Hollow Road. Michael's heart was pounding so heavily in his chest that he could not even gain the composure to look at his wife until they were all the way down Wood Hollow, waiting at the stop sign to take a left toward town. He put his hand on Melanie's wrist, still speechless. She turned to him, unruffled, guileless. What? She said. Ooh. We started on 87. Okay. I'm going to take a real quick break. 3 minutes. 3-minute break to get some snacks or some coffee. And come on back. And we're back. Starting on page 101, kind of at the top-ish. Chris remembered being a little kid, pretending along with Em that he had the power to make himself invisible. They'd put on some goofy baseball hats or cheap dime store rings, and bam, just like that, no one would be able to see them sneak into the pantry for an Oreo or empty the bottle of bubble bath into the toilet. It was a handy thing, the suspension of disbelief. And it was apparently something you outgrew pretty fast, because no matter what Chris did to imagine that no one could see him as he walked down the dull, narrow halls of the high school, he could not convince himself that this was truly the case. He kept his eyes straight ahead as he maneuvered around the salmon flow of kids between classes, couples making out against the lockers, and surly underclassmen spoiling for a fight. In class, he could just sit with his head ducked and zone out like he usually did. In the hallways, though, it was brutal. Was everyone in the whole school staring at him? Because it sure as hell felt that way. Nobody had tried to talk to him about what happened. Instead, they all whispered behind their hands. One or two guys he knew said it was good that he was back at school and all that, but they made sure not to come too close while they talked, in case unhappiness was contagious. You always knew, after shitty things happened, who your friends really were. It was perfectly clear to Chris that his one real friend had been Emily. 5th period, he had AP English with Bertrand. He liked that class. He'd always done all right in it. Mrs. Bertrand was after him to major in English in college. When the bell rang, Chris didn't hear it at first. He was still sitting slumped in his chair when Mrs. Bertrand touched his arm. "Chris?" she said softly. "Are you all right?" He blinked up at her. "Yeah," he said, clearing his throat. "Yeah, sure." He made a big production of gathering his books into his backpack. "I just wanted you to know that if you want someone to talk to, I'm here," she said. She sat down at the desk in front of his. "You may want to write about your feelings," she suggested. "Sometimes it's easier than speaking them out loud." Chris nodded, wanting nothing more than to get away from Mrs. Bertrand. "Well," she said, clasping her hands, "I'm glad you're all right." She stood up and walked back to her desk. "The faculty is planning a memorial assembly for Emily," she said, and the faculty is planning a memorial assembly for Emily, she said, and she looked at Chris, waiting for a response. "She'd like that," Chris murmured, and he dashed from the frying pan into the fire, where 100 pairs of curious eyes stood their distance. The irony of the relief that swept over Chris as he entered Dr. Feinstein's office did not escape him. This had been the last place in the world he wanted to be, but that trophy now belonged to Bainbridge High School. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his feet anxiously tapping. Dr. Feinstein himself opened the door to the waiting room. "Chris," he said, "it's good to see you again." When Chris chose to pace in front of the bookshelves, he shrugged and came to stand beside him. "You seem a little restless today," Dr. Feinstein said. "I went back to school," Chris answered. "It sucked." "Why?" "Because I was a freak. No one came up to me, and God forbid they should touch me." He exhaled, disgusted. "It's like I have AIDS." "No, scratch that. They'd probably be more accepting." "What do you think sets you apart from them?" "I don't know. I have no idea. I have no idea how much they know about what happened, and I couldn't get close enough to people to hear the rumors." He rubbed his temples. "Everyone knows Em died. Everyone knows I was there. They're filling in the blanks." He leaned against the back of the wing chair, skimming his thumb over the row of leather-bound books close to him. "Half of them probably think I'm going to slit my wrists in the cafeteria. What do the other half think?" Chris turned slowly. He knew perfectly well what the other half of the kids believed. Anything that could be escalated into a juicy story would be in the rumor mill. "I don't know," he said as offhandedly as he could manage. "Probably that I killed her." "Why would they think that? Because I was there?" He blurted out. "Because I'm still alive?" "Christ, I don't know. Ask the Coffs. They've thought that since day one." Chris did not realize until he'd spoken how bitter he was about the accusation, veiled as it had been. Does that bother you? Hell yes, Chris shrugged. Wouldn't it bother you? Dr. Feinstein shrugged. I can't say. I guess if I knew I was being true to myself, I'd want to believe that everyone would come around sooner or later to my way of thinking. Chris snorted. I bet all the witches in Salem were thinking that too when they smelled the smoke. What is it that bothers you the most? Chris fell silent. It wasn't that he was not being taken at his word. It wasn't that he was not being taken at his word. If the situation had been reversed, he too might have his doubts. It wasn't even that everyone in the world, in the whole GD, it wasn't even that everyone in the whole GD school was treating him like he'd grown 6 heads overnight. It was that, having seen him with Emily, they could believe he would never willingly hurt her. Okay. It was that, having seen him with Emily, that they could believe he would ever willingly hurt her. I loved her, he said, his voice breaking. I can't forget that, so I don't see why everyone else can. Dr. Feinstein motioned again toward the wing chair. Chris sank into it. He watched the teeny cogs inside the tape recorder chug in slow circles. Would you tell me about Emily? The psychiatrist asked. Chris closed his eyes. How could he convey to someone who'd never even met her the way she always smelled like rain? Or how his stomach knotted up every time he saw her shake loose her hair from its braid? How could he describe how it felt when she finished his sentences, turned the mug they were sharing so that her mouth landed where his had been? How did he explain the way that they... Oh my gosh, I think we're going to have to end this soon because I'm losing it. How did he explain the way they could be in a locker room or underwater or in the piney woods of Maine, but as long as Em was with him, he was at home? She belonged to me, Chris said simply. Dr. Feinstein's eyebrows lifted. What do you mean by that? She was, all of the things I wasn't. And I was the things she wasn't. She could paint circles around anyone. I can't even draw a straight line. She was never into sports. I've always been. Chris lifted his outstretched palm and curled his fingers. Her hand, he said, it fit mine. Go on, Dr. Feinstein said, encouraging. Well, I mean, we weren't always going out. That was pretty recent. A couple of years. But I've known her forever. He laughed suddenly. She said my name before anything else. She used to call me Kiss. And then when she learned the word kiss for real, she'd get it all confused and look at me and smack her lips. He looked up. I don't remember that exactly. My mom told me. How old were you when you met Emily? 6 months, I guess, Chris said, the day she was born. He leaned forward, considering. We used to play together every afternoon. I mean, she lived right next door, and our moms would hang out all the time, so it was natural. When did you start going out? Chris frowned. I don't know the day exactly. Em would. It just sort of evolved. Everyone figured it was going to happen, so it wasn't much of a surprise. One day I kind of looked at her, and I just didn't see Em. I saw this really beautiful girl, and well, Were you intimate? Chris felt heat crawling up from the collar of his shirt. This was an area he did not want to discuss. Do I have to tell you if I don't want to? He asked. You don't have to tell me anything at all, Dr. Feinstein said. Well, Chris said, I don't want to. But you loved her. Yes, Chris answered. And she was your first girlfriend? Well, pretty much, yeah. So how do you know, Dr. Feinstein asked. How do you know that it was love? The way he asked was not mean or confrontational. He was just sort of wondering. If Feinstein had been bitter or direct, like that bitch detective, Chris would have clammed up immediately. But as it stood, it was a good and valid question. There was an attraction, he said carefully. But it was more than that. He chewed on his lower lip for a second. Once, we broke up for a while. I started hanging around with this girl who I'd always thought was really hot, this cheerleader named Donna. I was totally infatuated with Donna, maybe even when I was still together with Em. Anyway, we started going out places and fooling around a little, and every time I was with Donna, I realized I didn't know her too well. I'd hyped her up in my head to be so much more than what she really was. Chris took a deep breath. When Em and I got back together, I could see that she had never been less than what I'd figured her to be. If anything, she was always better than I remembered. And that's what I think love is, Chris said quietly. When your hindsight's 20/20 and you still wouldn't change a thing. As he fell silent, the psychiatrist looked up. Chris, he asked, what's your earliest memory? The question took Chris by surprise. He laughed out loud. Memory? I don't know. Oh, wait, there was this toy I had, a little train that had a button on which it honked. I remember holding onto it and Emily trying to grab it away. Anything else? Chris steepled his hands and thought back. Christmas, he said. We came downstairs and there was an electric train running around the tree. We? Yeah, Chris said. Emily was Jewish, so she'd come over to our place to celebrate Christmas. When we were really little, she'd sleep over at Christmas Eve. Dr. Feinstein nodded thoughtfully. Tell me, he said, do you have any early childhood memories that don't include Emily? Chris tried to run backward in his mind, replaying his life like a loop of film. He saw himself standing in a bathtub with Emily, peeing in the water while she giggled and his mother yelled bloody murder. He saw himself making a snow angel, swinging wide his arms and legs and hitting Emily, who was doing the same thing beside him. He caught glimpses and snippets of his parents' faces, but Emily was off to the side. Chris shook his head. Actually, he said, I don't. And that's where we're going to end today. So he doesn't have any childhood memories without Emily in them, is where we're ending today. So we are on page 105. So let's see, reading number 7. This was reading number 7. And we went from page 87 to 105. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. I love you guys, and I'll see you in the discussion for this one. I've been doing the discussions together because it makes the video a little bit longer. Sometimes they would just be like way too short. So I'll probably do the discussion for 6 and 7 together, unless I already did. I don't think I did the discussion for reading 6 yet. So I'll probably do the discussion for reading 6 and 7 like in one video. And I should have that up today or tomorrow. But I love you guys so much, and I hope you're enjoying it as much as I am. Goodbye.
How y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.